The following podcast is offered freely through the Insight Meditation Community of Washington and by Jonathan Foust. To learn more or to make a donation to support this work, please go to www.jonathanfoust.com.
Sometime back in I think it was in the 80s, I'm really beginning to sound old.
Yeah, I think it was back in the 80s. Way back when, dagnabbit.
I had made a phone call to a renowned teacher by the name of Bo Lozoff. He developed something called the Ashram Prison Project, and he wrote a pretty famous book at that time called We're All Doing Time, where he was bringing the contemplative practices into the prisons, and really, really amazing stuff. I was putting together a conference, and I just thought he would be a really great speaker. I had heard of him. I didn't know much about him. So as we were talking about the conference, and I was talking about the structure and what the payments would look like and so forth, he said, well, I'm really going to mess you up. I'm going to mess up your system here. He said, I'll come, but I'm only going to do it with Donna. And I thought to myself, well, bring her along. And I'm really glad I didn't say that, because the word dana in Pali, the language of the Buddha, means generosity or by donation. So he explained to me how he operated and how his community down in North Carolina, how they did their service. Everything was offered freely. And participants were encouraged to contribute as they could. And the whole idea is the teachings are priceless, therefore they should not be charged for. There should be no price on the teachings because they are priceless. But as they're offered with generosity, generosity is encouraged. And I'm going to talk about generosity tonight. And I was so touched by his experience. He said in their community, everything was by donation. And things would be getting really tight, and then there'd be a check for $1,000 in a donation basket, and that would get them through the next period of time. And I had thought to myself, because I was living in a pretty kind of comfortable middle-class ashram where, I had a celibacy vow and so forth. It was very comfortable, I thought I'd like to take that on at some point. Take that on as a practice to offer freely and see what it's like. So I'd like to talk about generosity as a practice and as a path, and to touch on how foundational it is through this lens of Buddhist psychology or Buddhist philosophy, where generosity starts, how you practice it, and a little bit of how the practice of generosity is considered a path of liberation, a path of freedom. It's interesting how in Southeast Asia, the monks are fully supported by their local community. So they take their begging bowls and they go out into the community for their meals twice a day in the breakfast and lunch. There's some different traditions about it, but essentially it's all about owning nothing and receiving whatever is freely given, taking nothing, receiving what is freely given. In Vietnam, the monks wear very broad-brimmed hats, so when they beg, you can't even see the monk's face, just to create more anonymity about just receiving from the universe. But what's so cool in Southeast Asia is how the little kids, the little babies, when the monks come round, that they have their little handful of sticky rice that they put in the bowl. So generosity is so infused into the culture. It's very, very much part of the fabric of how the dana-based cultures operate. It's a very high percentage of money that people share out of their own personal savings. in Southeast Asia compared to the West. Imagine if you wanted to go to Southeast Asia to practice meditation. Almost anywhere you'd go, you could go to a monastery and you would be given food, you would be given medicine, and you would be given shelter, all free of charge, just to support you in your practice. I think the essence of the teaching is kind of a classic story where someone went to their teacher who had been practicing and experiencing lots of transformation. And this student said to the teacher, "How could I ever repay you for all I've received?" And the teacher said, "You can repay me by staying intent on your practice." And that's kind of the essence of it, is to support each other in our practice. So the essential stance in the practice of generosity is to see self in other and other in self, and to actively extend ourselves to others, to what we anticipate others need. But it's also paradoxical. There are lots of paradoxes about generosity, and one is that you really can't give unless you have something to give. So one of the paradoxes of being generous is to be full yourself, to start with yourself. You know, the classic story that's oftentimes used, way overused in Dharma talks, but when you get on a plane and they're showing you how the oxygen masks work, you know, you're told to put the mask on yourself before you put it on your child. And that's kind of that's the basic metaphor in life, is you have to be present before you can be present for others. And of course, particularly in our culture, we share among ourselves a very, very intense form of self-criticism, and in many cases, self-loathing. We live in a very, very competitive culture that's designed for comparison, and it kind of builds in the sense of that we're never quite enough, and what we have is never quite enough. John D. Rockefeller at one point was the richest man in the world, and a reporter asked him, "Well, how much money is enough?" And he thought about it for a moment. He said, "Just a little bit more." That sums up our human psyche pretty well. You know, just a little bit more. If it was just a little bit better. And so we hold ourselves to these impossible standards. I finally noticed for myself, and I often ask people this, that when you look at your to-do list, have you noticed how it's always beyond what's reasonable? Because there's some built-in sense that unless I'm uncomfortable in reaching for something, either my life is going to fall apart, or I'll lose my motivation, or whatever that may be. So practicing generosity and well-wishing for ourselves is really critical. The analogy that I find helpful, which I know I've shared here a number of times, really came up for me the first time when someone said, "You know, this yoga and meditation stuff, it is so narcissistic." And it definitely can have that quality. But I keep coming back to that phrase, "My cup runneth over," from the Bible. And when you think of your cup running over, it's when you're so filled with energy and goodwill. You know those moments when you can't not be nice? You know, when you start a conversation with someone, or you reach out just because you're full and you're overflowing. My sense of things is that getting your cup full to overflowing is actually your responsibility. That's your responsibility. Because when you're full and overflowing, you're contributing in a sometimes a magical way. So the question becomes, what's going to fill your cup? Oftentimes it has to do with a sense of deep listening, a sense of deep generosity toward yourself. and kindness and compassion. This little poem sums it up pretty well. It's entitled, "If There Is to Be Peace." If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. So we have to begin with ourselves. That's where it all starts, which of course is oftentimes the hardest place to begin. But when we can begin with ourselves and then offer it out, the practice of generosity can be quite profound. There's quite a famous figure in Buddhist history of a king by the name of Ashoka, King Ashoka. I was doing a little research on him, and H.G. Wells wrote this about him. Amidst the tens of thousands of names of monarchs that crowd the columns of history, their majesties and graciousness and serenities and royal highnesses and the like, the name Ashoka shines and shines almost alone, a star. A very, very interesting story about King Ashoka. He was an exceedingly bad-tempered dude. He had torture chambers. He conquered more land than any of his ancestors did, and he did it ruthlessly. His turning point was after some massive battle where they estimate more than 100,000 people were killed and 150,000 people were deported from the land. He was touring the battlefield, and he was overcome with grief and sorrow and regret for the incredible carnage that he was responsible for. And he saw the incredible grief among everyone on his side who lost people in that battle. And he also was aware of the suffering that he created among everyone at that time. At that time, he heard of the teachings of the Buddha, and he gradually became more and more influenced by the Buddha's teachings. And he made a dramatic shift from sort of being the warrior ruler by divine decree to taking on the idea of being a ruler by earning approval from the Sangha or from the community. So he did this massive social re-engineering, which has influenced Southeast Asia to this day. And one of the most important elements was drawing on this teaching of dana, or generosity. One of the very first teachings the Buddha offered after his awakening was to teach about generosity as a path. And he said, if you knew what I knew about generosity, you would never hesitate to share what you have. We'll talk a little bit about how generosity is really a path of liberation. But what he began at that time was turning attention to the common good and honoring those who wanted to practice by supporting those who wanted to seriously engage in these practices of freedom and liberation. And he was so enamored with this idea of doing good in the world, of being a force for good, being a force for wholesomeness. He had his scribe write down everything he did. And on his deathbed, he had that read back to him so he could reflect on all of his acts. I had shared here before how I was inspired by that when I was with my father on his deathbed. And I told the story of my father's life through this lens of his good acts. And it was such a very, very sweet moment to reflect back to him all of the good and kind and generous acts that he had performed. So the practice of dana, the practice of generosity, is a curious paradox because it's about transforming yourself. But essentially it's not self-centered because it's about seeing self in other and other in self. And it's not an intellectual practice. It's actual engagement into the act of generosity. So just as in our meditation practice, we make a fundamental distinction between the cognitive, which is the realm of thinking, the narrative, the planning, all of that, and the experience. It's really kind of a binaural thing. Either you're in the narrative or you're actually experiencing the here and now. And that same thing in the act and the practice of generosity. It's about bringing yourself back to that felt sense experience. So I thought we might just do a short meditation on this, if you like. So you might close your eyes. This will be just for a few minutes. You might just bring into mind someone who might be in need in your life, someone who might be struggling. And you might, in your own way, just offer them generously, offer them your best wishes. May you be happy. May you feel peace. May you feel safe. And as you reflect on this offering, what does that feel like inside? Can you locate that? If you were to make a phone call to someone who might be in need or struggling, just to say hello and let them know you're thinking about them, what would that feel like inside? Can you locate that? And exploring another quality. Can you think of a time in your life when someone was unexpectedly kind or generous toward you? And as you think about that, what does that feel like inside? How does your body, your nervous system hold that memory of someone being generous or kind toward you? And now gently deepening your breath. When you're ready, you can let your eyes open, or you can remain with them closed. So could you feel a little something there? Maybe a little warmth, a little tingling. And the Buddha kind of described it's actually kind of a quivering of the heart in response to that heart space. There's another angle to, we think of generosity as giving, but another part of generosity has to do about receiving as well. Some of us are more comfortable giving than we are receiving, and it's something to work on, I have found. You may be that personality type that is sort of naturally deflecting thanks that come your way. When someone offers gratitude, it's something that I specialized in myself. And one shift I had was I was at Spirit Rock, the meditation center out in California, and there was a teacher who had been very influential for me. And I just took some time to go over and just to thank him. You know, I'd followed his career and followed his teachings, and I said, "Thank you so much." And he kind of blew me off. You know, he kind of deflected, and I moved from feeling grateful to like, well, screw you. I mean, I actually had this like a real bitter taste in my mouth from that interaction. And it really made me reflect on how I do the same thing. And because what I realized was I was offering something out of appreciation. And because he couldn't take it in, the cycle didn't complete. So oftentimes what I have tried to work on for myself, particularly if someone might say, you know, thank you for what you're doing or something like that, I notice my tendency to not want to receive it and to deflect it. But what I do now is I listen, and then I wait a full second, and then I say thank you. So it forces me to take it in, but also I really get it completes the cycle. So it might be interesting just to reflect if your comfort level on receiving, and to realize that when you can't receive the generosity being offered to you, you're actually shutting down a cycle of energy. So if you're one of those people who has trouble receiving, it's a helpful thing to pay some attention to. Anyone relate to that? Yeah. It's been said that there are 3 benefits to being generous. The first is the thought of being generous is a wholesome thought. Oh, I'd like to do this for so-and-so. You know, I should call so-and-so. It's a pleasant feeling, it's a wholesome feeling. And then there's the act of being generous, which is very wholesome. And the third quality is the memory of being generous. So when you look back on that memory, it also has a wholesome quality. So it's a good thing. Generosity has a way of taking you beyond a confined sense of self to a much more broad sense of self. And that's where the path of generosity really is considered a path of liberation. There's a story, and there's actually a little YouTube video that's very, very cool out there that I stumbled across. In 1938, there was a young stockbroker by the name of Nicholas Winton, who's from Great Britain. And he went to Prague to see if he could help get any of the children out of Northern Europe before the Nazis were about to come in. And he set up shop, set up a little office, and was trying to figure out a way to get these kids out. It was just an impulse of his. And the story goes that he wasn't getting any attention because he was trying to do this through Great Britain and through the United States. So he got some stationery from another organization, and then he added his own name as the head of a subsidiary. And he managed to find homes for 699, mostly Jewish children. And he did a lot of, forging papers and so forth, but it was his intent to get these kids out. The YouTube video, which is just a real hair raiser, is they had, I think he was maybe 101 years old in a theater, and he was just sitting in the theater, and they were giving a tribute toward him, and there was a person who he had saved, who was now in her, I think probably in her 50s, and she was sitting next to him, and she turned to him and she thanked him, and he had tears in his eyes. And then they asked anyone else who had been saved by him, and the entire theater stood up. And he turned around, and here was this collection of kids, now middle-aged, that he had personally saved. That's pretty dramatic. But I really do feel that at the end of our lives, what we reflect on and what has the most meaning is those we touched, those we had some wholesome connection with. So the practice becomes being a well-wisher of all, taking this stance of generosity. I have really come to really appreciate and love teaching through this system of generosity. To know that anyone who's interested in these practices, that no one will be denied access to come here for this class or to come to a retreat, and that your support supports me and what I do, but also makes it possible for other people to come. It's really kind of a magical thing. How generosity is tied into liberation is that it directly moves against three roots that are the cause of our suffering. Oftentimes they're called the three poisons. And these are greed, hatred, and delusion. And that is that natural inborn part of the human experience to hang on, to control, to want more, which is all about that tightly bound sense of self. Or it's all about pushing away, about aversion, anger, judgment, blame, ill will. And again, that reinforcement of a tightly held self. And it goes directly against the third, which is delusion, which is believing something's true that's not actually true, or believing something isn't true that actually is true. These are the three fundamental causes of our suffering. Anytime you feel caught or stuck, it can be a very, very helpful reflection. Is there anything in the suffering that has to do with greed, with holding on, with control? Is there anything about the suffering that has to do with aversion, ill will, judgment, blame? Or what am I believing that's maybe not true? When you practice generosity, you automatically counteract those three qualities because you're moving beyond a tightly held self to a much, much larger sense of self, or we could say no self, just pure presence. So it's about cultivating wholesome states. And there are three things that it does. When you're generous, it weakens your attachment to things. when you give something, you're less inclined to hold on. The second thing is it creates good karma. That is to say, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So when you are generous, you are cultivating a wholesome state, which begets more wholesome states. Kind of the whole pay it forward thing. And the third element, and this was an interesting one, is that it develops mental pliancy, which is actually kind of a prerequisite for enlightenment or for liberation. That is to say, anytime you can let go of something you're holding on to and offer it freely, that's the state that actually makes you susceptible to awakening and to non-ordinary states. So it has a way of addressing these roots of our suffering. It has a way of cultivating wholesomeness. And it has a way of opening us to new possibilities where they didn't exist before. This is always such a curious time of year around generosity and gifts, and it really makes me personally kind of ill. You know, the pressure of getting someone something that they don't know they need, but by your sensitivity you have reflected to them that you know something about them they didn't know. To do that, it's more psychic torment than I can bear. So so I thought we might just close with a reflection on generosity and on being present. And I thought we might do this with a little meditation on sound. So if you like, you can close your eyes. And there's a quality of offering ourselves freely that is dependent on our capacity to receive fully. In these moments, you might just sense what it's like to receive the moment as it is. In particular, it could be helpful to open the sense doors, to receive sensation, to receive the breath. And to receive the impulse of smell and taste and sight. And a particular form of receiving is to receive the sounds just as they're happening. You'll notice that in sound meditation, you cannot hear better by trying harder. There's a quality of a deep receptivity. And you might let your attention open to the sound of the flute and the space between the sounds.
And gently letting your breath deepen. And as you're ready, letting your eyes open.